We've all been there, watching a movie we thought was amazing only to find out that someone else absolutely hated it. Or going to a restaurant that a friend swore by only to think that it was terrible. I mean, you probably said to yourself, I'm never going to listen to that guy again. Well, music, it kind of works the same way. You might totally vibe with a song that someone else can't stand. It's also subjective, and that's part of the fun. Finding something you truly love, even if others just don't get it. Coming up, we're going to dive into that spirit and shake things up a little bit with a countdown of the top 5 songs from the 80s from bands that should have been so much bigger, including a female singer that's gone missing since the 90s, as well as a band that was so worried about not selling out that it stopped them from being the greatest band of the 80s, and another that's been called the Stairway to Heaven of the 80s with a haunting guitar drone that came from a butter knife. The stories and the songs are coming up next on Professor of Rock. Hey, music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. If you ever won a game of Scrabble with a made-up word that you made everyone believe was real, you're going to dig this channel of deep musical nostalgia. Make sure to subscribe below right now. Click the red, it's a white button. Click the notification bell so you always know when our stuff comes out. Also, go to professorofrock.com. I'm serious. We're turning this into the MTV, what MTV used to be when they played music. We would like to get your take there. I have to admit, this was one of the most fun top 5s I've done in a long time. I was actually seeing that a few of these bands are some of our most requested bands from viewers who'd like to see us cover some of these songs. And these are songs that should have been so much bigger than they were, but even more than that, from bands that should have been much bigger than they were. Some of them were really big outside of the U.S., but here in the U.S. didn't do as well. But they're songs and bands that everybody knows. In fact, this was one of those coulda, shoulda, woulda, so I'm going to call this show Shoulda. The top 5 shoulda songs by the top 5 shoulda bands should have been so much bigger. All right, so let's get into it. Coming at number 5, our countdown kicks off with an exceptional cover of a song that opens with a wonderfully romantic line. Are you ready for the time of your life? I'm telling you, this is acapella magic. It's the acapella reimagining of Caravan of Love by a band that was massive in their homeland, but they never quite made it here in the States, but they shoulda. The Housemartins at number 5. Every man join the Caravan of Love. Now, the original version of Caravan of Love was the creation of a group that billed themselves as Isley Jasper Isley. The writing credits were split between the 3 of them. Isley Jasper Isley were brothers Marvin and Ernie Isley and their brother Chris Jasper, all former members of the Isley Brothers. After breaking away from the family group, the trio led by Chris Jasper wrote and produced Caravan of Love, using Jasper's interjections to weave Christian beliefs into their music. Now, this song became their biggest hit. It reached number 1 on the Billboard R&B singles chart, but it actually stiffed at number 51 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1985. It would be their only major hit before they went their separate ways into solo careers. That happened in 1988. Now, the British quintet, the Housemartins, were big fans of Caravan of Love. They appreciated every soulful nuance of the Isley Jasper Isley tune, and they also loved the Isley Brothers. Putting out an a cappella song as a single, that was a bold move for the Housemartins, as bold as their band name. The decision to remove all the instruments and focus on vocal harmonies was a big departure from their signature sound, from songs like Happy Hour. But the band's fearlessness really paid off. The a cappella version of Caravan of Love was a smashing success. It reached number 1 on the UK singles chart. This was in late '86. Stand up, I'm your brother. It was only the second a cappella song to achieve that. The first was the Flying Pickets a cappella cover of the Yazbal Only You in '83. Now, as wonderful as their cover of Caravan of Love was, it got zilch in America. Not even a ripple of interest. However, the mega success of the track in their native UK didn't save the demise of the Housemartins. After releasing their final single, There's Always Something There to Remind Me, another great song by this band, in April of '88, the Housemartins announced their breakup. Later that year, they bid farewell with the compilation album, Now That's What I Call Quite Good. And I'm telling you, you got to trust me on this, one of the best greatest hits albums of the 80s. Mark my words, every song is great.
Which gives me fun, fun, fun. It's the house where we can stay. Better to you when I drink.
The members of the Housemartins, they had massive success outside of this band. In fact, they all stayed in touch and collaborated on each other's projects over the years. Norman Cook found major success with Beats International and then later as Fatboy Slim, while Paul Heaton, Dave Hemingway, and former roadie Sean Welch went on to form the Beautiful South.
She's my sister, don't you know?
Norman Cook's Fatboy Slim released many cool tracks such as Rockefeller Skank and Praise You, which was a big hit here. And the Beautiful South had tremendous success in the UK, scoring 23 top 40 hits on the British singles chart, including their first release song For Whoever that went to #2 in a little time, that went all the way to #1 in the UK in 1990.
The tears you weep, so cry, love and cry. I've had them in times to find the truth.
A very demented band. I mean, just listen to Woman on the Wall, for example. It's a great song.
Cry freedom for the woman in the wall.
Carrying up the charts, the best of compilation for the Beautiful South was actually the fastest selling album in British history at the time it came out, moving past the Beatles. Coming up next on the countdown, another amazing song and act that should have been so much bigger than they were. Now I'm cheating a little bit here because this song technically came out in early January of 1990, but they recorded it in the 80s, and they're definitely tied to the 80s. Number 4, I've got the Sundays, another British act with Here's Where the Story Ends. Now, if you've never heard Here's Where the Story Ends, let me start by raving about Harriet Wheeler's ethereal lead vocal. It is haunting beyond words. One of my favorite female vocalists ever. Even the title alone carries a deep melancholy weight. At its core, this song tells the story of a woman who fell for someone for the wrong reasons, made mistakes, faced shame, and ultimately learned to reflect on a terrible year with a bittersweet, almost nostalgic perspective for it. The Sundays were a UK alternative rock band formed in London in '87. Featuring guitarist David Gavin, vocalist Harriet Wheeler, bassist Paul Brindley, and drummer Patrick Hannon. Yeah, my friends and I felt that they had a sound very similar to the Smiths, with an incredible female vocalist. I mean, I would put them near the top of my list for greatest band of the early 90s, even though they only released a couple albums. Harriet Wheeler and David met as students at Bristol University in the mid-80s. Wheeler was from Reading, and was the daughter of an architect and a teacher, and studied English literature. And David, originally from Wembley, pursued a degree in Romance languages, focusing on French and Spanish. The two fell in love, they moved in together, and after graduating, spent their free time writing music while collecting unemployment benefits. The evolution of the Sundays and how their story ended is shrouded with bad luck and mystery. Here's Where the Story Ends was actually the second single from the Sundays' 1990 debut album, Reading, Writing, and Arithmetic. It became their breakthrough hit. It actually reached #1 on the Billboard Modern Rock Tracks chart in the US, but it was not released as a single in the UK, surprisingly. It was largely because their record label, Rough Trade, went bankrupt. Remember, Rough Trade was also the Smiths label in the 80s. That was an insurmountable obstacle that stifled their once promising future.
Surprise, 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 surprise.
Sadly, they just never came close to matching the success of that debut record, even though their next couple records after that were great. There's another clue why the Sundays had such a brief run. It's how quickly everything fell into place. In 1988, an early gig drew a crowd of music journalists and record label reps, sparking a bidding war to sign them. In just a year and a half, they went from their first live performance to releasing Reading, Writing, and Arithmetic. Even before we had a single out, we were on the cover of music magazines, is what David would recall in 1997. There's quite a lot of pressure on their shoulders from the outset. Harriet once described the Sundays as something of an accident, a happy accident. She said, "There was never a time I wanted to be incredibly famous or even in a pop group." I mean, even to this day, the Sundays remain one of music's greatest mysteries. A cult favorite frozen in time with just 3 albums. I mean, a perfectly 90s thrift store aesthetic that's Pinterest gold, I might add, and a growing army of young fans. I mean, artists like Lauren Mayberry and Muna and B. Baba Doobie. They cite Harriet Wheeler as a major influence on their work. But their sudden disappearance has fueled one of the internet's most dedicated detective hunts, minus an actual crime. Case in point, a Twitter or X account that's been calling out into the void since 2020 with the same burning question. Harriet Wheeler, where are you? Hell, I've tried to track him down for an interview for like 10 years. Maybe someday. Getting back into the countdown of the top 5 Shoulda Been Bigger from the 80s. It's probably the most talented songwriter of the 80s who was so focused on not selling out that it stunted what could have been the best rock band of the 80s. At number 3, I've got the godfather of the underground sound, Paul Westerberg's The Replacements from Minneapolis, Minnesota, with Can't Hardly Wait. Oh, this is such a great song. Can't Hardly Wait comes from The Replacements' 5th studio album, the brilliant Pleased to Meet Me, but its history goes back a bit further. Paul Westerberg actually wrote this after the Let It Be sessions, and the band tried recording it for Tim in 1985, only to shelve it until Pleased to Meet Me. The final version features none other than Alex Chilton on guitar, along with a horn and string arrangement that stirred up some debate within the band. I don't really know why, it's brilliant. Now, Paul Westerberg composed Can't Hardly Wait. He explained that the reason that the song got tossed around for a few years is because the Replacements were, in Paul's words, not feeling it. And that was kind of the problem with the band the whole time. They tried so many times to work it out that they just got tired of the song. Now, Paul admitted one early version was attempted at Nicolette Studios where they spontaneously recruited Michelle Kinney, a trained cellist who happened to be working as the receptionist. She would say, there wasn't any sheet music. Paul just stood in the control room singing parts to me through the headphones and kind of conducting me. He was hilarious and animated, calling me maestro the entire time. Oh, Paul Westerberg, so many great stories about him as I've done interviews throughout the years. Hurry up. By the time the Replacements hit the studio for Pleased to Meet Me in 1987, they'd pretty much written off Can't Hardly Wait. Dead, long gone, over with, we're not going to record it again. That was the general vibe coming from them. But somehow they got talked into giving it another shot. Westerberg hung over in a Holiday Inn, took another pass of the lyrics. He said, so we started with this quiet guitar, and everything fell in from there. And you know, with Alex Chilton on guitar, such a fitting collaboration since the band were huge fans, and of course they paid tribute to him on the album with the song Alex Chilton. Track also includes horns from members of the Memphis Horns and strings courtesy of Memphis State University's Max Holz. While Westerberg begrudgingly went along with the horns, he wasn't thrilled about the strings. He actually joked, it's like the Replacements trying to sound like 1968 in our own feeble way. I don't think there's anything feeble about it. This is a great track and the way they used it. The Replacements, they're one of my favorite bands ever. And they had some singles that performed well on the modern rock charts. They had I'll Be You, that went to number 1 in 89. And Merry Go Round also topped the modern rock survey in 90. I'll Be You actually almost hit the top 40 overall. You be me for a while, I'll be you, to watch the merry-go-round. But Can't Hardly Wait, it didn't fare so well, despite being such an obvious infectious track to my ears. It didn't make it onto a national or international chart for that matter. It's just shocking to me. It's so damn good. The Replacements are one of the most frustrating bands of all time. As one famous artist told me, on one night watching their live show, they could be the greatest band in the world, the best thing you'd ever seen. And then the next night, they'd get so drunk and sloppy, they were like the worst band ever. But for my money, they released some of the best music of the 80s, and they should have been one of the biggest bands ever. That's a head scratcher for sure. Let me know if you'd like more on the Replacements. All right, the track at number 2 on our countdown of the top 5 Shoulda Been Bigger songs and bands. This one's a real head scratcher. Maybe I should say ear scratcher. During the late 70s and early 80s, one of the biggest bands in England was The Jam. And although their song Town Called Malice was a #1 single on the British singles chart, one of the biggest songs of that year, it barely moved the needle here in the US. But we're proudly putting it at number 2 on our countdown. Town Called Malice, it's such a great song. It's a track that hits hard and fast. Recorded by The Jam for their album The Gift, it debuted at #1 on the UK singles chart in February of 1982. Actually, the title was inspired by Neville Shute's 1950 novel, Town Like Alice. Though Paul Weller admitted in 2012 that he hadn't actually read the book when he wrote the song. Despite that, the title stuck and, wherever inspiration comes, even if you don't read the book. Paul actually confided that A Town Called Malice was rooted in his experience growing up in Woking, reflecting his working class upbringing and his desire to break free from it. I feel like some of the reviews from back in the day really captured the essence of the song. It's kind of fun to go back and read reviews from newspapers and music magazines, especially when the songs and the albums first came out. Sometimes they're just so dead wrong, but in this case, they got it right. I love what the Irish Independent said. They described it as a class war tirade set to post-punk Northern Soul groove. Very cool. And then Greg Freeman of The Guardian at the time called it a song with a stomping Motown-inspired beat. One that carried with it a sense of pent-up rage and frustrated ambition. And it truly was a powerful, gritty anthem, perfectly capturing the spirit of the time and, Paul Weller's drive to escape the constraints of his small-town life. Something I can definitely relate to, or could relate to at the time I heard it when I was living in Blackfoot, Idaho. The Jam came together in 1972 at Sherware Secondary School in Woking, Surrey. Started out with Paul Weller on bass and lead vocals along with a few friends jamming together. Their first gigs were at a local club called Michael's, but by the mid-70s, the band really started to come into its own with Weller, guitarist vocalist Steve Brooks, and drummer Rick Buckler locking things up. And Town Called Malice ended up being the Jam's third #1 single in the UK. It was a big hit, coming in as the 10th best-selling record of 1982, according to the official charts company in Britain. While it never made much of a splash here in the US, it did make it onto the mainstream rock tracks chart. Actually hit number 31 in 82, the band's only appearance on a major American chart. And that is crazy. On October 30th, 1982, after wrapping up a world tour, Paul Weller actually made the announcement that the Jam would be breaking up, disbanding. It marked the end of an era with their final performances on Top of the Pops and The Tube, where they promoted their last single, Beat Surrender, another great song. The tour had already included 5 consecutive nights at the iconic Wembley Arena, selling them out. The decision to break up the Jam, that was actually all Weller's. At the time, he explained that he didn't want to keep going just because they were successful. Years later, ahead of a 2015 Sky documentary on the band, he told the Daily Mirror, "I wanted to end it to see what else I was capable of, and I'm still sure we stopped at the right time." So he didn't regret it even years later. He said, also, "I'm proud of what we did, but I didn't want to water it down or risk becoming embarrassing by trying to go on forever." Following the split, Bruce Foxton and Rick Buckler were so bitter, they actually didn't speak to Paul Weller for over 20 years. In early '83, Paul Weller made a bold move announcing the formation of a new band, the Style Council. This time it was a duo with keyboard player Mick Talbot, who had previously been part of the mod revival of the Merton Parkas. The Style Council was a big departure from the Jam's sound, embracing a more eclectic pop-influenced style. You might remember when Tears for Fears referenced it in Sowing the Seeds of Love. Kick out the style, bring back the jam. And when you know it, after quitting one of the biggest British bands ever without a hit in the US, his new band's song, My Ever-Changing Moods, climbed to number 29 on the Billboard Hot 100 here in America. Made it Paul's only pop hit in the States. The song also found success elsewhere, hitting number 11 in Ireland, becoming a massive number 5 hit in the UK, where the Style Council enjoyed a string of top 40 successes. Style Council released 2 other singles that I also think should have been bigger, Long Hot Summer and You're the Best Thing, both sensational ballads. Love Long Hot Summer.
Long hot summer just passed me by. 'Cause you're the best thing that ever happened.
All right, we're at the number 1 position, and I don't think you're going to be disappointed. If you are, this is one time where you're just wrong. Sorry. At number 1, we have a song that was famously called the Stairway to Heaven of the 80s by somebody who knew what they were talking about, the late Seymour Stein. My favorite band of all time, I've got the Smiths, and their 1985 opus, How Soon Is Now. You know, when I think of masterful songs from the 80s, How Soon Is Now is the first one that comes to my mind. It was and still is a fascinating, mind-altering track.
Just like everybody else does.
I gotta tell you, the Smiths guitarist Johnny Marr, he was on a serious creative roll in June of '84. He cranked out, get this, How Soon Is Now, William, It Was Really Nothing, and Please, Please, Please Let Me Get What I Want in just 4 days at Earl's Court in London. I'm telling you, I would put that output and that quality of songs in 4 days against anything that the Beatles ever did in 4 days. I mean, seriously, I'm just not over-exaggerating.
Let me get what I want.
The early demo of How Soon Is Now was actually called Swamp. Unlike most Smith songs, which had lots of chord changes, Marr wanted to experiment with sticking to a single chord, F sharp, and building the entire track around it. Producer John Porter was all in on this idea, and the result became a revelation. In July of 1984, Johnny Marr hit London's Jam Studios with bassist Andy Rourke and drummer Mike Joyce to lay down the music for How Soon Is Now. The night before, they'd been out celebrating after recording William, It Was Really Nothing, and Please, Please, Please Let Me Get What I Want. But by that next afternoon, they were back in the studio ready to get down to business. Producer John Porter, he liked the riff Marr had come up with, but he felt the song needed something a little bit extra. Their conversation drifted to Elvis Presley's early recordings, which led to a spontaneous jam of That's All Right. Now, somewhere in that jam, Johnny Marr started playing around with the chord progression from his demo Swamp, and that experiment ended up shaping the song's final arrangement. Marr and Porter came up with the idea to add a tremolo effect to the guitar part, and it would change everything. Okay, now this was inspired by a few different things. It was inspired by a mix of Bo Diddley's signature syncopated shuffle guitar, Hamilton Bohannon's disco stomp, and the 2 guitars in the instrumental break of Can's I Want More. Now, to make it happen, they ran the original guitar track through the studio desk into 3 separate Fender Twin reverb amps, each set with a different tremolo speed. Marr and Porter would tweak each one by hand while the music played, trying to keep it all in sync. Now, when things went off track, engineer Mark Wallace would rewind the tape and they'd have to start all over. Some of these segments were only about 10 seconds long, but they knew they were onto something. Johnny's other standout guitar part came after each verse, a harmonic lick that quickly caught attention. Now, interestingly, it was almost a direct nod to a sympathetic vibraphone part from Lovebug Starski's 1984 track, You Gotta Believe. Marr wasn't just borrowing the sound, he had a purpose. He saw it as a response to the critics who had been quick to label the Smiths as just mere 1960s revivalists. But it didn't stop there. The oscillating guitar sound drew comparisons to the one in the Rolling Stones cover of Bo Diddley's I Need You Baby, Mona. So, a lot of different influences here. It was just the beginning of Marr's riff-stealing relationship with the Stones, really. A relationship that would continue to shape his work in the years to come. There's also the rumor that during his experimentation of sounds for the guitar parts of How Soon Is Now, Johnny Marr actually placed a guitar on the floor of the studio and he dropped a butter knife on the open strings. He then captured that sound and looped it with a heavy dose of reverb. Lots of reverb. John Porter sent Morrissey a rough mix of the song in the mail. The very next morning, Morrissey showed up and got straight to work on his vocals. He flipped through his notebook, pulling lines from various unfinished ideas and made them all fit together like a puzzle. According to Porter, Morrissey nailed it in 2 takes. Not surprising. The Smiths set the mood for their recording session by installing red light bulbs in their London studio, casting a warm, almost eerie glow that seemed to seep into the very soul of the music. It really was the perfect setting, intimate, electric, and brimming with anticipation as they prepared to capture the essence of a classic song. And, as for the brain-twisting title, it came from a question in Marjorie Rosen's feminist film study, Popcorn Venus. It was one of Morrissey's all-time favorite books. It was a subtle tribute to something he was very passionate about and to the influence of the works that shaped his lyrics. So you go and you stand on your own. John Porter and the 4 members of the Smiths were all in agreement. They absolutely loved How Soon Is Now. They knew they had something really special. But much to their surprise, here we go, the label, they didn't share that same enthusiasm. Of course, anything that's a little bit different, they're scared of. Initially, they relegated the song to the B-side of William, It Was Really Nothing, almost as if they were trying to bury it. But DJs, they had other plans. Late-night British personalities, including the legendary John Peel, Janice Long, and Annie Nightingale, they picked up on the song almost instantly. Within weeks, it became the most requested track on all of their shows. The song's growing popularity couldn't be ignored, and by November 12, 1984, it was added to the Smiths compilation album, A Hatful of Hollow. Following January, the label had a change of heart, and they released it as a single, turning it into one of the decade's most compelling tracks. When you go home and you cry and you want to die. How Soon Is Now? Seymour Stein, who ran Sire, one of the greatest labels ever, called it the Stairway to Heaven of the 80s, and he was right. It hit the charts. It hit number 5 in Ireland, only went to number 24 in the UK, but the song was much bigger than its chart position. In 1992, it found a second life, climbing back up to number 16 in the UK charts. Across the pond, it didn't ever make it to the Billboard Hot 100. But that didn't stop it from becoming a staple at modern rock radio. Back in 85, there were only a handful of commercial stations that even played that kind of music. I still remember the first time I heard the Smiths on one of these stations. It was based in Salt Lake City. I would tune into that station during family road trips from Blackfoot, Idaho, down to Utah to visit relatives, and it was there I became a lifelong disciple. And I'll tell you what's interesting, my business partner that's helped me on Professor of Rock since I met him 10 years ago, started the first alternative new wave station in Utah, and it was his station that I would hear when I traveled down in the late 80s or the mid 80s. And then we connected all those years later. So pretty cool. It was like a connection there. That completes our countdown of the top 5 songs from the 80s and top 5 bands that should have been bigger, much bigger. I got to tell you, this countdown was a blast for me. It made me revisit some songs that have a special place in my heart and in my soul. And like with all my countdowns, picking just 5 was not an easy feat, but I truly believe the 5 tracks we highlighted in this episode should have been so much bigger. It's always puzzled me that they weren't, or that these bands weren't bigger. But I guess when it comes to music and entertainment in general, it all comes down to that age-old saying, to each his own. Can't tell you how many comments I've read where people said, you're insane, or I love it. This is my favorite song of all time as well. Again, we like what we like. So let me know, what are your memories of these songs? Do you remember these bands? Check them out. I'm definitely going to link to them below. I know sometimes we say that and we forget to do it, but I'll make sure that my editor does that. And let me know what else you'd like to see. What are your memories of these songs? What do you think of these bands? Would you like to see any of these more in depth, like the Housemartins, Replacements, the Smiths? I've only covered the Smiths a few times, even though they're my favorite band. So let me know. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends.